Hey there, Willowbrook, and thanks so much for doing our daily Devo. Today we are in Luke chapter 10. I want to look at a passage that is in Luke chapter 10, and I can almost guarantee that whether you've ever opened the Bible or not, whether you've ever stepped foot in a church, that you are familiar with this story, because it is a story called the Good Samaritan. Now, Good Samaritan is language that we use in our culture that doesn't even have to do with whether or not you are a Christian, whether or not you've ever opened a Bible. This is something that a lot of us are familiar with, and sometimes we don't fully understand it in the context as a Christ follower, as a person who has a relationship with Jesus. But Jesus has something for us to learn in this story that is more than just what the culture might have for us in here. And so we start in verse 25, and it says, "On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. 'Teacher,' he asked, 'what must I do to inherit eternal life?' 'What's written in the law?' he replied. 'How do you read it?' The expert of the law answered, 'Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself.' Jesus replied, 'You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live.'" Now let's stop right there, because one of the things that is so easy is to read about love. Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor. That's pretty easy. In fact, it's pretty easy to talk about love, to talk about the people that you love. It's easy to listen to someone talking about love. It's easy to write about love. It's easy to sit and watch a movie that's about love. We love love. We love to talk about it. We love to think about it. We love to experience it. But what's harder is to love. Now, sometimes there's people that are really easy to love, but there's some people that aren't as easy to love. And Jesus is going to talk about that, because he doesn't want us to just think about love, to just talk about love, to just write or read or watch a movie about love. In fact, he wants us to take it a step further. And that's when in verse 29, it says that the expert of the law asked Jesus, "And so who is my neighbor?" And Jesus said this: "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him for dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan..." Wait, what? Now listen, everybody that was listening to Jesus right now, if they had zoned out for a second, if they were starting to doze off, if they were playing Wordle on their phone, they stopped. They heard a trigger word. Oh, wait, a Samaritan? Oh, wonder what the Samaritan did. Like, I'm in this, right? And so Jesus said, "But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper. He said, 'Look after him, and when I return, I'll reimburse you for any extra expenses you may have.' Now, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" The expert of the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." And Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." Now, this is really important, because Jesus is showing us 2 people that are neighbors. One, the one that is hurting, is your neighbor. It is the one that you're supposed to love. But who else was the neighbor to the person that was hurting? The Samaritan. The one that there was an emotion that welled up in them when they even heard about this Samaritan. Listen, there are people, there are groups of people, there are people you think about, maybe individuals, groups, whatever. There is an emotion that wells up in you of distaste for this person, for this group of people. And Jesus is saying, hey, who's your neighbor? That person's your neighbor. That group is your neighbor. That hurting person is your neighbor. And he says, so what do? You love them. And you don't just talk about loving them. You don't just think about loving them. You don't just write about or watch movies. You love them with your actions. You don't have to agree with everything they do, You don't have to dismiss the fact that maybe there's hurt involved, but you do have to acknowledge that they are an image bearer of God, and that we've been called, especially as followers of Jesus, to bear his love. The one that is loving us can now love others. And so, listen, this is not something we're going to perfect today, but it is something that we can surrender and acknowledge that the God who loves us, in fact, in John, Jesus said, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Now remain in my love. How much are you hanging out in the love of Jesus? As you hang out in the love of Jesus, you can love people not to earn his love, but from his love you are loved. And you can love others even when it's hard, by caring for them, by meeting their needs, by being part of God, being God's hands and feet to reflect his love to others. Willowbrook, I love you, and I hope that you'll have a happy Wednesday.